My name, I guess I should start with my name. My name is Liz Rosenfeld. I'm a visual artist, a filmmaker. I am a queer person in many respects, that is identifiable and unidentifiable, I would say. I am a Jewish, USA, American, German person as well, with all of those diasporas. I am a trans non-binary identified person. I am a big lover. And like a radical slut. I am I think I'm a big lover, and I'm also like a big fighter and a big arguer and a big edger, I would say. That's a good few words. Let me just check with my background. I guess I sort of gave you my background. My privileges are many. I am somebody who has the privilege of holding two very heavy passports. One is German because of the roots of my German Jewish family. My grandparents are Holocaust survivors, one of which was from Berlin, actually. And I also have a USA American passport, and I consider that to be one of the biggest privileges of my life, that I still hope to continue to also use in different accessible ways for others as much as I possibly can. I am at the moment in between body in terms of passing in a gendered space. Sometimes I pass as a white male person, and sometimes I don't pass as any gender, and I consider that, particularly as a white position, to be a huge privilege that I'm constantly shifting and thinking a lot about as my body changes and as my outwards presence changes to visible presence changes to the world. I have the privilege of a safe home, of people surrounded around me who are my friends and also my family who take care of me and love me. I have the privilege of doing what I absolutely love to do to support myself in this life, in many different manifestations, which is at the most sort of simplistic explanation. I am an artist, a caretaker, a writer. I get to engage with the things I really care about so far up until now as my livelihood, and I consider that to be a huge privilege. And I also have the privilege of being a queer person. That's a complicated question for me. Because I think it sort of calls for like a very macro, large kind of consideration, and also like a kind of many micro-focused answers. On a larger scale, I think I sort of answered that in the first question. I am a German and USA American citizen living in Berlin. I am a white, Jewish, non-binary, trans person living in Berlin. And that affects that is a huge effect in terms of the community in which I'm living in terms of the neighborhood, for example, which is a huge immigrant community of predominantly non-white people in Berlin, in Neukölln. And in general, I think a lot about in my work the responsibility of taking up space in lots of different ways, not just in terms of like the access to art spaces, the access to the stage, the access to the gallery, the access to the institution, the school in general, but also the access to moving through landscape and communities and neighborhoods. So that's something I think a lot about living in Neukölln every single day. I also live in a total bubble. I live in my queer, very protected, privileged bubble of Berlin, where if I feel ever threatened in any way, which is rare, and I am lucky in that way, I actually really, going back to the privilege, really have the privilege of living in a way where I, unlike many people in this world, don't have to feel a constant state of being threatened in my everyday life. And I'm in a very protective and loving group and family of found queer kin, I would say. So that is very much where I live and exist. What else is just having, in what context? Well, yeah, that's how I would say the context I live in day to day, very much so. I guess also part of that is, what I was going to say is, this is an interesting question because it makes me think about a kind of idea that I approach a lot in life and work, is how you touch the world and the world touches you back. And what that means particularly for different kinds of queer bodies moving through the world. And what that experience is and how it differentiates every single time you leave the house. What you are engaging with, what you're also disassociating with in order to get through the experience of being out in the world as well. So yeah, I think that statement or that idea really kind of speaks to this question of where do you live? How do you walk through the world? How do you touch the world, and how does it touch you back? I think this is a really great question that I'm constantly asking myself, actually. And I don't know. I can only say I know who's reacting to me. And I'm very grateful to who that is, because it's largely young queer folks who are looking at my work in different ways, reading what I'm writing, what I'm making films about, performances about, creating space about. And I think that if I'm thinking about who my audience is, that's absolutely a large part of who I am thinking about, because for me, as well as I'm now like middle-aged technically, the concept of queer elders has always been a very important part of my life as a queer person. My whole life, actually, if I really think back to even before I articulated myself or any identity of myself, I was, if I really think about the people I look to or the figures I look to, they were all very queer presences, bodies, identifications. So I think that that's who I'm trying to speak to, or who I'm in a lot of conversation with. And I'm really grateful for that, because I really do think that more, as we continue to create queer space and history, intergenerational relationships are one of the most important elements of care, of sustainability, of future making. I really don't believe in this kind of idea of a utopic kind of collectivity, but I do think that the more we learn to care for each other, and also, I really mean like constantly learn, not just learn at a young age, but learn at every age, because caring and needs are constantly changing, and also to recognize that bodies are in transition always somehow. I learn a lot from younger generations than me, and I don't mean it in a kind of, I try not to sound ageist in any way, because I think that's also something that happens a lot with, somehow all my friends who have who are now in their 40s start to talk about the young people, and I find it really problematic, because I think, first of all, they're on the journey on some level that we have, in a kind of broader sense, they're on the journey of aging that we're all on. They're just at a different point than we're at. And I really think that learning does not just go in one linear direction, which is up. I think it has no linearity. I think it's completely, all over the place and messy, and you find it in cracks and in leaks and in messiness. And I think part of that is recognizing what we see in each other, regardless of position or age, or not just in terms of what we see in each other, but also what we feel from each other. And I really appreciate that about the younger generation. Because this is people who I'm in most of the dialogue with about what it is that I put out into the world, which is why I'm specifically speaking to this. And it's also the people who I'm learning the most from at the moment. And I find that the older queer artists and scholars and thinkers get, and maybe this is a controversial statement, the more closed down we all get to how things change really fast, because there's this fear of irrelevancy that everybody holds on to as they age. I think particularly in the field of culture and the arts, and where we're all producing ideas and producing work and making space in different ways, and engaging in activism. And I just wish there was a way to really eradicate that fear, and that there is no such thing as irrelevancy. There is more of an idea of being willing to be dismantled by newness, because I think that's really queering time and space, so that it's not this linear kind of idea of honoring sure, we should be honoring and taking care of not just the elders, but of people who need care in different ways, and who are connected to, but also in particular this sense that there's only one way of learning and exchanging knowledge. And I think that this is something that really needs to change in order for queerness to continue to shift, and the politics around queerness, I should say, in particular, and how we live life, really. Putting my commitments into practice, that's such a, I think that statement is the goal of personally, of being a thinker, an artist, a practitioner. I wouldn't necessarily identify myself as an activist, because I think I know real activists, and that is not me, but I'm certainly an ally in many ways, and I in my own way deal with politics and visibility and access and care in my work. but I certainly I wouldn't call that activism. But the way in which I'm really invested in desire, actually, which is like a very, very big topic for me in everything that I've made my whole life, or everything I've produced or put out or discussed, the way I have relationships. And I think that I have a commitment to exploring a kind of unfillable, I like to think of it as this like unfillable hole of desire, and to explore and push the boundaries of what that is within myself, and what that can be in my work. So that manifests in a lot of different ways. It manifests, well, I would say that the root of all of my artistic work is performance, and is the body and the materiality of the body. It always has been my whole life. And that's where I'm learning from, and the narrative that I know from is the body. And of course, because we're always in a state of transition, the body to me is like the site of the inspiration, and it's the site of knowledge. So I would say my commitment comes from my body. And certainly the commitments of, like, those commitments consistently change. It used to be how I can push myself in ways that were limitless, and now it's more about how I can take care of myself in ways that provide more energy for me, and time and space, and also energy for being able to, give in all the ways that I want to give as well. I know I'm sort of asking this, devices and modalities of action. At the moment, I would say I'm learning all of that. I feel like I'm in a sort of relearning phase of modality and action in my life, which is not to constantly do. I don't really know what that is yet. But I think I'm an overdoer in many respects, and I don't think it's necessarily about the concept of rest, which is not necessarily like a narrative that I talk about. I think it's about actually doing less to create space for more. I mean, that's where I've gotten so far. I don't know what that is yet, though, so that's something that I would really like to know and learn, I would say. But the ways in which these ideas and feelings manifest is, again, through the work that I make. And that, to me, is, even if it's, teaching a seminar, or leading a seminar, or creating a space, or making a work with a group of people, collaborating, or drawing by myself, or writing, it's all coming from the same. I can link all of those modes of creating and doing together, and they really all come back to the root of the body for me. So I think that answers the question. Okay, yeah. I think this is the hardest question, obviously. That's why you're asking it. Yes, I mean, I would be lying if I said I did not come from and have been deeply influenced by many different kinds of feminist ideologies, politics, notions, stories, experiences. I was very lucky to be mentored and educated by some of the most incredible self-identified feminists from, a time when people were very, some of the first people to identify themselves publicly as feminists, Do I agree with the politics of those times now? No, I don't, largely, because a lot of it had to do with whiteness, separatism, racism, exclusionary politics. I often think of this amazing video, and I say amazing because it's kind of like amazing in this way of like, whoa, of Judy Chicago in, I think I want to say it was sometime in the 70s probably. And it's a clip of her in this room with all these like housewives. That's how it's presented. I'm not exactly sure how she lured them into this kind of organizing room. And she is sitting at this like, you know, kind of like office space with all these housewives. I think it was at Woman House, I want to say, actually. It was in one of those feminist organizing spaces. Essentially, you know, on her soapbox, lecturing them about how they need to change in order for the future and for history and for politics and for like female liberation to change. And I remember seeing this at a really young age, like 18 in school, and thinking how fucked up it was. Also exhilarating. You know, it's like one of those things you can't look away from, because it's like someone who is so in their element, really speaking the truth that she was feeling in that moment so articulately, so masterfully, and with so much passion and like, you know, force. And I thought, God, I really admire that feeling of what does it feel like to have this kind of notion or this feeling in your body specifically, like there is no choice but this. Not that I agreed with that choice, but the feeling of undeniably we have no other choice but to move forward in this way if we want politics to change. And of course, you know, when I was 18, we didn't have words like non-binary, TERF, any, you know, like the idea of exclusionary politics to me was very much presented in terms of like lesbian separatism versus like heterosexual feminists, and then also a Black feminist movement. And as, you know, again, coming from a USA American context, this is how I was learning about feminism. And then people like Monique Wittig and, you know, voices like hers, Louise Bourgeois, were coming in different ways as well. But again, it was so focused on this very like 70s feminist, largely white context, until I was introduced to Audre Lorde, for example, Octavia E. Butler, etc. And I now, you know, many years later, recognize the importance of who was teaching me about these voices and how they were teaching me, and also the very like narrow lens through which I was being taught about feminism. And this isn't to say that the people who were teaching me were narrow-minded. It was just it was where they were coming from. It was what they knew. And I often think now, how could that have been exploded earlier rather than later in the context that I was in? Because I was in a privileged context of, this is school, this is university, this is thinking, this is, you know, discussing, critiquing. This is not what I would necessarily call real life. Or it is real life, but it's not like, you know, many of my mentors were imprisoned for their politics at one point. Many of them were women who had been working as artists their entire lives and never really had, and still are, and never were really supported by what they considered to be the art world that, you know, they edge towards or edge on. And so I also felt this, as much as I was feeling like an exhilarating feeling of having the opportunity to be so close to these incredible women, I also felt a deep frustration as a young person being taught by so many feminist identified voices, because at the time, which was 20 plus years ago, there was still this, and I'm sure still today, there was, in a very different way though, there was this sense of invisibility that was just like really powerful and very much something that I felt linked all of them deeply. And I think about all of them often, and how lucky I was to be, it was almost like I was in the right time, right place kind of a thing, to get to know these women who were, part of Women House, part of incredible art movements that people don't know much about, but that were really impactful in the communities they were in. I wouldn't have learned about artists like Laura Aguilar or Ana Mendieta if it hadn't been for the women who knew them. And it also taught me a lot about kinship and friendship. And so in that sense, I do identify with a feminist politic, in terms of care, in terms of kinship, in terms of friendship. But I think, unfortunately, feminism, as we all know, has become this concept that's been so neoliberalized in the last while, and also as a result has become very, very deeply torn apart, and there's a lot of skepticism about how it's used, and I completely understand why. And I wonder how we can honor that important history and not erase it, while also looking at, how do we, again, this kind of question is, how do we look at the past? How do we look at the elders? How do we honor them? How do we look at their work as essential moments in, queer history and feminist history and art history, and also very respectfully dismantle that work. And this is something that I'm really, as I get older, it's something that I'm very excited to be open to by other generations of practitioners and thinkers and activists and however identified feminists